First of all, let me thank you all for coming out to listen to Dickie and I. You could probably be doing something that's more enjoyable than listen to two elected officials. But I want to thank you too, because I think from the standpoint of the Tea Party and the activities you all have been involved in and what you all have been doing, you really heightened the awareness of more of our citizens on what issues are that are concerning not only our country but our state and our locality. And I think that's been a good thing. You know, I've been in office for about 19 years now, and the thing that I saw from the standpoint when I first started and to the point now is we kind of took a dip. People just kind of, what I would consider, went on autopilot. They really didn't find out what people were doing, whether it's in Washington or Richmond or in Staunton City Council chambers. But I think that's changed. I think people are much more engaged again, and I think there's more of an uptick in interest in what's occurring. And I want to thank you all for that, because meetings like this and the activities you all are involved in and your leadership is much appreciated. Let me talk real quickly about some big issues I see coming up in the General Assembly session, talk about specifically some of the things that I'm involved in, and then try to save questions that you all might have at the end, or if something comes up that I've mentioned, just stick your hand up and I'll try to answer that as I go through this as well. As Dickie said, one of the things that's the biggest bill that we deal with, the most important thing that we deal with, is the biennial budget, and we'll be making changes to the budget that we put in place. Now, a lot of people wanted to know why we've been in session so long and why we went back and did the revisions and why that was so important. There were two reasons. One, the revenues, as Dickie said, the tax dollars that we expected people to be able to pay, but that they would pay, was much less than we anticipated. The way our process works, we estimate the taxes that you and I are paying, because we have a pretty good track record in Virginia about estimating those revenues. We always tend to be conservative in that estimation. That's why, as Dickie said, we had some of those surpluses, but we're only talking $100 million or so. But we've got a budget that's based on $35 billion a year. $100 million is a lot of money, but in perspective, it's still that kind of surplus is still a pretty small percentage of the overall budget. But the estimates were basically off what we anticipated, and that's because of the things that Dickie mentioned: sequestration, the economy in Northern Virginia, and Hampton Roads in particular, are kind of the drivers, if you will. If you look at the valley and the central Shenandoah Valley, and then Central Virginia, part of Virginia, those are doing pretty well. They're pretty much on par, pretty much where we expected them to be. I think that's partly because of the agriculture base that we have. That kind of stabilizes things, it diversifies our economy here locally, which is a good thing. But in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, they are dependent on defense spending. And it's not just dollars that goes to military installations and ship construction and intelligence gathering and all those things that the federal government does and spends money on. And even though I'm not a federal legislator, I do think the federal government's first responsibility is to protect the United States of America, and I think that needs to be a priority. But they are making cutbacks with the sequestration. Now, you remember sequestration was supposed to be a last resort. That wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And we can debate whether that's was good or bad or whatever, but it's happened, and we're feeling the effects of it in Virginia. And it's not just those military establishments or installations in Virginia, but it's mainly that, and we have a lot of contractors, people in the private sector that are doing business with the Department of Defense and providing services for the Department of Defense, and that's where we've seen the real reduction. So that's why we've been trying to adjust our budget because of that fact. So we went into special session to complete the budget in June after the regular session, and then we've been making adjustments because we were still in special session to accomplish that. And that's a good thing because it puts us on par in being realistic so that we can balance the budget for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, unlike the federal folks in Washington, we do balance our budget. It's required, and we do it. That means we have to prioritize. That means we have to cut spending if we don't have the revenues, and we're doing that. And in fact, for this next session, for the second year, we still have to cut $272 million or more in things that we provide funding for from the state standpoint. So we're going to have to work on that. As Dickie said, the governor will present his recommendations to do that and for spending for the second year of the biennium, and the General Assembly gets a chance to look at that. Now, the other reason, from a Medicaid standpoint, it was important to go ahead and do this, and I will tell you this because I know you've been interested in that issue, is because if the governor tries to hold Medicaid over our head like he did during the regular session, we've got the budget in place. So we have a 2-year budget. It's technically in place. If we don't get agreement or he tries to hold that over our heads, we can go and leave Richmond and say the budget's in place. You, Governor, have to come up with the $272 million or whatever to balance the second year of the budget. We've told you that's how much you need. He has the discretion to make and to appropriate dollars up to 15% in a situation like that. So he can't use that as something to hold over our head because we're going to go into Richmond and say, we're going to work with you. If you try to put Medicaid expansion on the table as part of the deal, that's off the table. We don't have to stay in Richmond. And from a strategic standpoint, that puts us in, I think, a better position. So that's why we've done this extra work this year, because if we can't get agreement with the governor or the Senate for some reason, because even with the Republican majority, they have a few members that want to see Medicaid expansion, they try to hold up everything over that. The House will be able to say, we've got a budget, it's there for 2 years, the governor has the discretion to come up with the additional cuts, we're done. So I mentioned that to you because I think that's important. Now, from a budget standpoint, the most important thing is going to be, and we've told the governor this, we want to try to find ways to spark job growth. We're not going to spend a lot of money to do that, but there are ways that we can incentivize or to help the private sector continue to grow our economy. One way is to kind of help those defense contractors find other ways to diversify their businesses. Another way is to provide certain incentives that may make us more competitive than other states. But the way we do that, and I always have to mention this is because we get a lot of questions, is we provide incentives to businesses, whether it's a tax credit or a grant, but they have to have skin in the game. It's not a free ride. And if they don't meet the job growth numbers that they tell us they're going to do as part of their application process to meet the requirements for the credit or the grant, we take that money back from them. It's called a clawback provision. So we try to put protections in there so that, yes, we want to help them. We want to really try to get them going and moving along. But if they don't meet the requirements, we take that money back. And I think that's prudent for taxpayers. Dickie mentioned education reform measures. We'll probably have some higher education reform measures as well that will be global. He talked all about the ethics related things. I will tell you, even though I think that's an important issue, you know how many average citizens have come up to me since all this has happened and said that's the #1 issue, that's the most important thing I want you to work on? You know how many? 0. They're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about what's going on in the federal government, they're concerned about where we're spending the dollars, they're concerned about what I call those tabletop issues that impact all of us each and every day. Ethics is important, and I think all the things that Dickie mentioned we need to look at, we need to look at it reasonably. But the average Joe, 0 constituents is that that's the issue I want you to work on. So, so hopefully we'll be measured in how we approach that and do it in a good way. Now let me talk about specifically some of the bills that I have. And Ed, these that I've got the bill numbers are already up on the system. And I know Sandy and other folks who know how to use that. It's easy to go on our state General Assembly website and look at the bills that we introduce. And I'm going to give you a couple of numbers, but I'll be glad to give you the full list once we get all those, because we're tracking those as well. Let me talk about a couple that I've introduced early that I think are important. And then I'll have a couple about education, and then I've got one I want to talk to you about that's more of a political issue, but I think it's important for you all to know and get your all's input as well. First and foremost, there's been a lot of discussion, there's going to be a lot of discussion on how do we reset in Virginia and nationally our state and federal relationships between the federal government and the state governments. As you know, the 10th Amendment was put there for a purpose. Unfortunately, that purpose has not been abided by, either by the federal government, and to a certain extent, the states have not asserted themselves from the standpoint of their responsibilities and what the 10th Amendment grants states. And after the 17th Amendment, when we started electing our U.S. senators by popular vote, as opposed to having the General Assembly or a legislative body elect them, the Commonwealth of Virginia really has no representation in Congress. And so I have come up with two things that I think are important to try to reset, if you will, that relationship. As part of this discussion is always already occurring, and there's a lot of discussion, and you all might have gone to some presentations. There's been some in the Valley. There's going to be some this weekend at the Republican Advance in Northern Virginia, with a concept called the Convention of States. And there's a debate going on about whether Article 5 allows the Convention of States, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I personally have some concerns about the concept. I think, yes, it implies that can occur. My concern going forward is, and I think, I wish Dickie were still here, because he told me one time we were having a discussion of this, he said, what makes us think the people in the Congress or in state legislatures today are smarter than the founders who wrote the Constitution in trying to determine how we can rewrite, how we can right the ship of states, so to speak. And I thought that was a good point. Some of us have a concern that, yes, it implies that a convention of states could occur. For me, it comes down to, and I've told the folks and been meeting with folks that are in favor of the Convention of States, that the question comes, it's a trust factor from the standpoint of the people that may be involved in that. And I do think there's one remedy that folks that the Convention of the States proponents are proposing, and that is somehow to delimit a delegation of what they can and can't do. The question is whether they can be limited or not. That's one of the questions. Then there is the requirement, as you all know, that the states still have to ratify any amendments as they come back. And again, I would say that the only time we've had a convention generally of the states, other than for compacts, which states did do from the standpoint of getting together to talk about various issues and that kind of thing in the history of the country. That was early on in our history, though. We haven't had really a lot of those other than compacts that we have now that are set by state statutes, but every state has to adopt the same exact statute for a compact to be put in place. And it has to be exact. And if the state doesn't do it exactly the same way, then they can't join the compact of states. Interstate cooperation for transportation, other things. So there are examples of that. But not since the Constitutional Convention have we had it's something that would be as broad as I think what's envisioned by the Convention of the States. So that's one concern for some of us. The other thing that I tried to do was, one, what is a way we can from an ongoing standpoint, try to, at least from Virginia's standpoint, bring more communication and accountability to our 2 U.S. senators and our members of Congress. And one of the things that actually the House of Delegates used to have was a standing committee in doing some research. And I'm trying to find out what the state Senate did maybe in the past, but a standing committee that was dealing with federal regulations, so that if there was a federal law that was passed, they actually could communicate with the federal representatives about how that impacts the state, whether it was a good idea or not. So what I came up with was House Bill 1283 that would form a commission on federal oversight that would be made of members of both the House and Senate that would be responsible to meet at least once a quarter, 2 times a year at least, with the federal representatives to share concerns and to bring to them basically the concerns that the legislative branch and state government has related to all those things that impact from the federal government that impact the state. A few I would mention, Medicaid, and these have been done under Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. It's not a partisan thing. Medicare Part D is a good example. No Child Left Behind is a good example. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is a good example. So there are many examples of things that have occurred just in the last 2 U.S. presidential administrations. BRAC, sequestration, are another examples of impacts directly on Virginia, where we really had no contact or no say. So what this would do, at least set up a mechanism to kind of try to restore that communication and that connection. And more importantly, I think more accountability to those representatives at the federal level. Now the other thing, because I also agree with the proponents of the Convention of the States, I understand the frustration, I share a lot of the concern that they do in that we have to or should try to do something. That's why I proposed the commission idea, because I think that's something we can proactively do. The other thing that I did, and I came up with this with the help of other folks, is to try to have actually Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution amended so that it would be clear that states could hold the Convention of the States, but could only do one amendment at a time. One of the things that I have a concern from the Convention of the States standpoint is they want to have a series of amendments potentially considered by the body at a time. And again, I think there's an idea to propose some legislation to limit our delegation, but we can't do anything to limit what other states' delegations do. And maybe some of those other states would do something similar from a state statute standpoint. But there's still the question whether you can limit the body or not, and that's the debate I'm trying to get more information on. I've been going to a lot of meetings, I've been listening to a lot of the proponents on this, and I'm still trying to do that. I'm trying to get to the point where I have an ease with the idea, but I'm not there yet. And there may be a way to do that, and there may not, but that's kind of where we are. But the proposal would be to have calling on Congress to amend the Constitution to make sure it's clear that the Convention of States would only basically have one amendment at a time. And then I think that comfort level would be there so that you wouldn't have something else occur that maybe it's not an unintended consequence. Now, granted, again, states still have to ratify any amendments, and there is that protection, but I will be honest with you in saying that probably 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, I probably would have felt more comfortable about the concept. I don't feel as comfortable with the concept because, to be honest with you, I have a great distrust of the folks at the federal level, and to be honest with you, I have some distrust with my colleagues in other states and what they may do. And some of the other states I have no problems with. I think they would probably be like Virginia, be responsible and reasonable. But we can't control other states. Virginia can't control other states. And the one thing I think that the Convention of the States folks have told me is that they think if they get enough states to move that down that road, that it may get Congress to act, and that may be the case. I also think that we could do that through the amendment process and trying to get Congress, to act as well. So, so at this point, I'm still trying to get more information, but I've got that concern. And I'll be honest with you, it's, as I told somebody the other day, it's kind of a gut concern, and just not trusting my fellow legislators in other states, and more importantly, not trusting the federal government, which is really what we're trying to solve the problem. So we're, I think, all on the same page. I think we just see a little bit different way to approach it. Now, let me talk about, real quickly, about some public education issues. I know Vicki spent some time. And actually, Sandy's here, so I'm going to give her credit for two of these. She and I, over the last year, have been having discussion on what can we do to protect student privacy and identification information. As you all know, states, federal government, local governments, we collect a lot of data. And we collect a lot of data to try to make better decisions on where we're spending money, how effective that money's being spent, how like students are being impacted. But to get that data and to know and understand kind of what's occurring, you have to find out about what each student, what each school, what's occurring in the community. But we don't have to identify the student so specifically that we infringe on their privacy rights, or more importantly, make it so that somebody else could access information specifically about that student. That's never been the intent of what, at least in Virginia, when we collect data, what we're trying to do. So Sandy and I had a discussion over the last year. One of the things that we found out is that, unfortunately, it is state law that localities, even though many of them don't use this identifying number, they use another assigned number to identify a student. So it's very anonymous, but we still require that they collect Social Security numbers. But as you all know, we've moved away in every other part of government from collecting Social Security numbers, because we know once you've got that Social Security number, you can use that for all sorts of things. And use that person's name, and they may not even know it. Or you can use the Social Security number to access information that people don't need to have access to. So we're going to have a piece of legislation that's House Bill 1307 that will basically do away with that requirement and allow the Department of Education, working with local school systems over the next year, to make sure they use an identifier that's anonymous and that's consistent across the board, so that every locality is not just kind of doing something willy-nilly. So I think that'll be a good reform. I'm sure some people, as Nikki said, will probably oppose that because they think that somehow they need Social Security numbers. But most school systems I've talked to have moved away from that anyway, so I don't think that'll be a big burden for them. The other thing that I looked at, and with Sandy's help, we looked at what some other states are doing, and one of the things we also don't do is if students' information, because they still collect addresses, who your parents are, and you have to have that, because if you want to be able to contact the parents if there's an emergency, you have to have some of that personal information. Well, they're supposed to keep it protected and make sure that it doesn't get divulged to anybody, but there's no requirement that if they do accidentally, say somebody comes and steals something from the school, well, there's no requirement that they've got to let the parents know that somebody accessed their kids or their personal information. So what this legislation would do, House Bill 1334, would have the schools be required to contact the parents if that information, again, was revealed. And again, they try to protect it, but we live in a world where people, unfortunately, can hack information. They do it all the time. We've seen it with big corporations. We've seen it with government agencies. People mistakenly take and have information that are on laptops that are supposed to be protected and those kinds of things. So this would make it so that if something accidentally happened, unintended obviously, they would have to contact the parents and say, hey, your information was compromised. And I think that'll help the parents, because then they can be on the lookout to not only to protect their child, but also, more importantly, hopefully look out for their own well-being. The last two things I'll mention real quickly related to higher education. One is when a student, usually these are advanced students in high school, take an advanced placement test, they get and can get college credit for that, which is a good thing because it helps speed the college experience, and they can go ahead and get credit in high school for attending college. The problem is, in Virginia, we let the universities and the colleges determine whether that credit will apply or not for that college, even though in other states, what they do, they set a standard and they say, okay, this history course, advanced placement test, you get 3 credits or you get 4 credits. And most states have come up with a system where it applies no matter where you go. If you want to go to Virginia Tech, if you want to go to UVA, you don't have to, abide by their requirement. It's the same test. You passed it. You got the passing grade. It should apply in a Virginia institution the same way. So what we're doing is saying you pass it, you get the same credit, whether you go to Virginia Tech, UVA, or wherever. And I think that's fair for the student, rather than trying to figure out, okay, I passed this. Now, who's going to be able to use this for my credit? Credit should be a credit if you pass the test. Now, I know I'm going to get pushback on that one because the universities are not going to like having that discretion taken. But the way I've structured the bill is to allow SHEV to work on the standard, what the credits are, so it'll be consistent across the board, and it'll allow them a year to get this up and running, and they can apply it then. And it'd be very hard to just, kind of just start it without giving them some time to prepare and to work on that. So that's what that will do. And the last thing I'll mention, and then let's talk more about Convention of States, is I also am introducing a piece of legislation. I don't have the bill number yet because I haven't filed it, is to require party registration. Now people say, well, I was talking to my legislative assistant, she said, why do you think that's a good idea? Because she has often tried to challenge me on things when I do it, and I like to have people that work for me ask me why you were doing things or why this or that's important. One, she needs to know why I think it's important so she can respond to people, but more importantly, I think it's important for a couple reasons. One of the things that we have in Virginia is a primary. Well, primaries I think are fine. The problem is in Virginia it's an open primary. So if you're a Democrat, you can vote in the Republican primary. If I'm a Republican, and I've never done this, but I could vote in the Democratic primary. I've always thought if I'm a Republican, I shouldn't go vote in the Democratic primary because I want to go, help nominate the folks that are involved in the party that I represent. So the way we're structuring it is, I think it would serve 2 purposes. One, it will make sure that the primary system is what it was intended for, and that is to nominate people of that party. Now, you don't have to register as a Republican or Democrat. The way it would work is, if you don't want to register by party, I think a lot of us would have, generally not have a problem with that. But if you have a problem with that, you can register as an independent. The independent would get to choose which primary they would like to vote in. If they're, but you can't vote in both. You can't go vote in the Republican one. You can't go vote in the Democratic one. I think that would strengthen our system, and more importantly, and I've introduced this in the past. I actually think the parties ought to pay for the primary, but I'm starting with the party registration. Then if I get that, maybe next year I'll then come back and try again. I've tried that before, but I will tell you, there was bipartisan opposition to that. Republicans and Democrats both opposed having the parties pay for the primary. But I think they really should, because it is a party nomination process. And right now, the folks in the local governments are having to run those primaries. But one thing at a time. But I think this would help, hopefully, with the question about who's influencing whose process. And I also think it would strengthen the primary process for both parties to utilize and be secure in the thought that the folks that identify with either party are actually voting in those primaries.